room. It's indeed time for the France-24 debate. It was 10 years ago this Tuesday.
At this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign.
George W. Bush finishing the job his father started a decade ago and toppling Saddam Hussein. That turned out to be the easy part. In a matter of weeks, U.S.-led forces were in Baghdad, but they found no weapons of mass destruction and suddenly owned a conflict whose cost to be measured in the trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives lost. By the time Saddam Hussein was executed in late 2006, a power vacuum had long since prompted a full-scale civil war. And even though U.S. troops withdrew 15 months ago, the sectarian violence continues to this day. At least 57 killed this Tuesday in Baghdad in bombings targeting the Shiite community. 10 years on, where is Iraq going? How does it impact the conflict? How did that conflict there impact U.S. foreign policy going forward? And with us to talk about Iraq 10 years on, from Baghdad, Prashant Rao, Bureau Chief for the French news agency AFP. Thank you for being with us. We want to thank for joining us from Washington. He covered Iraq for the National Security Council under George W. Bush. Charles Dunne, former diplomat with the Washington think tank Freedom House. Thank you for being with us here in the studio. Iraqi writer Hilal Al Abidi and senior producer at I-Télé television, the all-news channel, Menget.
Good evening.
Welcome, sir. The France-24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. Let's begin, if you will, by rolling back the clock. February 2003, the United Nations Security Council in New York.
What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community.
The U.S. Secretary of State's show and tell display that day would fail to convince allies from the first Gulf War that there were weapons of mass destruction inside of Iraq.
This message comes to you today from an old country, France, from a continent like mine, Europe, that has known war, occupation, barbarity. It's an old country that does not forget and is very aware of all it owes to freedom fighters who came from America and elsewhere.
Charles Dunne, when you think back to those days in 2003, were you among those who started eating freedom fries instead of French fries?
No, I wasn't, and I have to tell you, I deeply regret the fact that U.S.-French relations hit a modern low point during that particular time. I was at the Pentagon at the time, serving on a staff that was trying to examine what the post-war implications were and how to plan for the messy period ahead. And I have to admit, I was full of trepidation about what was going to happen. I, like many different people, were convinced that there were plausible reports of weapons of mass destruction in the country. That turned out not to be the case. But even beyond that, I was terribly worried about what the implications would be for going into that country. And we're seeing this playing out now again, of course, 10 years later in very messy and destructive ways, I have to say.
All right. It's a point that we'll, of course, look at it in detail. Menget, you were telling me just before the show began that this time 10 years ago, you were at the border between Kuwait and Iraq, ready to go in. Did the French press think there were weapons of mass destruction?
We didn't know. We didn't trust basically Colin Powell's speech, neither we trusted the Dominique de Villepin's speech. There was a strange feeling at that time. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know who was lying. And so basically the only way for us to see that was to try to enter in the country. We knew that the American and British army at that time were they wanted us only to be embedded with them. They didn't want to have journalists going around there. But we managed, not only French journalists, French, Spanish, American, British journalists. We were what the US Army called wildcats at that time, and we managed to enter in Iraq just before the American army. In front of the American tanks, and then we traveled inside the country between the lines, between the Americans and the Iraqis. But we didn't know about the weapons of mass destruction. Some very important American journalists at that time were telling us they are weapons of mass destruction.
New York Times later wrote a 5,000 word apology.
When you're a French young reporter reading in the New York Times that there are proofs, you don't know who to trust.
Hilal Al Abidi, who did you trust at the time? What did you think of the invasion?
We speak a lot about this subject at the time on 2003. Actually, we realized that it would be a crime to invasion in Iraq, and nobody hear us as a people. Nobody hear what we say because our voice is lost between thousands of voices who want the war.
What did you think at the time of Saddam Hussein?
Really, the best answer at your questions, what happened in Iraq today? What do you think?
You miss Saddam Hussein?
I don't miss him because really Saddam Hussein was a dictator. Nobody can ignore that. But what happened after Saddam Hussein is not just, is not fair, if you like.
All right, the anniversary, as we said at the outset, marked in an ominous manner with bombs going off in Baghdad. One of those who heard the bombs was France 24's James Andre, who joins us now from the Iraqi capital. James, what was the scene like earlier in the day?
Well, basically, we were out filming, and indeed, we heard two large explosions. We saw a plume of smoke go up behind one of the buildings, really quite close, actually a few hundred yards. And then we saw all the security forces arrive on the spot very quickly, and then helicopters appear in the sky. But what was really quite impressive was the way the city just shut down completely, very, very quickly. Indeed, the security forces were on alert, and then they went into maximum alert. So a lot of roadblocks were set up. They were controlling most of the cars, and very, very quickly the streets of Baghdad emptied completely. This anniversary has really been marred in blood here. Indeed, there have been like 17 car bombs, 7 roadside bombs, and 2 assassinations today, which is a very, very violent day indeed. It's the worst day here in Iraq for the last 6 months, when back on the 9th of September, 76 people were killed, and it was a stark contrast with the days before when we were here. But it's true that you have to remember that these kinds of coordinated attacks across Baghdad happen quite often. We've been here for a week, and it's the second time it's occurred. 3 or 4 days ago, there was another attack of this type which killed 21 people. And well, indeed, in Iraq, 300 people die every month as a result of this violence.
And just very briefly, James, how does that compare? The last time you were in Iraq was at the end of 2011. How different is the mood today?
Well, today the mood does look a bit like it was back then, but indeed the city has changed a lot. We've been seeing a lot of people out in the streets. Yesterday, for example, we went to film in Abu Niwas, which is a park which is along the Tigris River, and we saw all the children playing. There was a television series being shot just there. A lot of people just watching the director and actors working. It was very relaxed in the past few days. Baghdad looked like a pretty normal city. Of course, it never really is a normal city. There are power cuts. There are all these concrete walls everywhere. Lots of parts of the cities are very divided. There are roadblocks everywhere, a lot of weapons. and of course a lot of problems. There's very high unemployment. We've met some people, a lot of people trying to say that they wanted to leave the country and asking us if we could eventually help. But we've also seen a lot of people saying that they were sick and tired of this sectarian violence and that they all hoped that indeed Iraq could come together again and things would calm down. The people they accuse for this violence are the politicians. They say that it's because, most of the people we've talked to anyway, say that it's because of the politicians and local politics that indeed this sectarian violence is as it is and on the rise specifically today.
James Andre, many thanks for that update there from Baghdad. Prashant Rao, you who's permanently based there, the amount of bombings going on today, when you heard James Andre describe how surprised he is to see the city shut down and then suddenly pick up, for you, is this just some ordinary stuff?
Depressingly, it is to a great extent. There are all too frequent attacks. As your correspondent said, it was only a few days ago where there was a massive coordinated attack on the Justice Ministry, a fairly well-fortified complex very close to the Green Zone, in which 30 people were killed, and 2 suicide bombers apparently got into the building itself and managed to blow themselves up. These things happen, I wouldn't say regularly, but far too often for a city of this size and these many innocent people.
Now, the narrative that we've heard, Prashant, here in the West is that there was this surge, that it helped to stabilize things, and that afterwards, Iraq, even though it's violent, it's more of a low-level sort of violence. But you, who's living inside of Iraq, what's the difference between today and the high point of the killings back in 2006, 2007?
Well, unquestionably, the violence levels are not even comparable at this point. In the worst years of 2006 and 2007, thousands of people were dying every month in Iraq, and now we're in the sort of low hundreds. Our numbers last month put it at 220, and this month is slightly less than 200. So the numbers themselves aren't comparable by any stretch, but it is an incredibly violent place. I mean, we're still talking about 200 people dying on a monthly basis in enormous attacks. I mean, you said earlier, 50-something people died today in just one day. This is an incredibly high level of violence. And the one thing about the surge that, sort of critics of it will say is that it did reduce the level of violence. That I don't think anybody questions. But the strategic goal of political reconciliation, that is really, it never really happened. And as your correspondent said, a lot of people here blame the politicians for the violence, and the lack of political reconciliation, I think, is something that could be tied somewhat directly to that.
At the top of the show, Charles Dunne, you were describing how the invasion's about to begin, and you're busy at the Pentagon trying to come up with, plans of how to go about this, what to do next, etc. What do you think, looking back now, what could you have done differently, or what could you have done? Is there anything you could have done to stop this sectarian violence?
Frankly, to be honest, I think we needed to have a much better plan in place to establish physical security in Baghdad and other cities in Iraq from the very beginning. And the fact that the United States did not have that plan in place, I think reflects the fact that there were at least 3 separate planning streams going on, which were not connected to one another in any way. And there were philosophical differences within the U.S. government over what needed to be done. So, for example, you had the Pentagon leadership who fairly, frankly felt that you could go in and you would establish a certain level of security without committing enough troops. When you look back at historical models of how many troops are needed in a post-conflict situation, it was completely disproportionate to what we actually ended up putting on the ground there. I think that frankly was the main thing. Disproportionately low, yes.
And Lucas Menget, seeing you went to Iraq when it was at that high point of violence during that surge when the fighting was at its worst. At the time, did you sense that there was light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, we thought during the surge that they found a solution. The surge was on the ground a good idea because they managed to finance and to reverse the violence from Al Qaeda. They paid the guys from Al Qaeda. I remember working for France 24 and being in the areas around Fallujah where the leaders of Al Qaeda became leaders of the kind of militias helping the Americans. And that was working. And as the AFP bureau chief said, the level of violence is still very important today. But compared to what it was in 2006, it was dozens of bombings every day in the country. And we have to remember that the turning point of this war was Fallujah. Even in 2003, just weeks after the war, this part of the war, the invasion of Iraq with the Americans and the British, few weeks after the end of the official war, problems started in Fallujah. And Paul Bremer, the main mistake of the American policy in Iraq, never realized the problem of Fallujah. We were going to Fallujah on a daily basis. It's not far from Baghdad. And Fallujah, we remember this image of the bridge of Fallujah with the 3 guys of Blackwater killed by the population. That was the beginning of the civil war in Fallujah. But even before, there were signs. And the Americans looked like they didn't care about Fallujah. But Fallujah was the main Sunni city around Baghdad.
And Prashant Rao, those militia leaders, those Sunni militia leaders that were effectively, as Luca was describing, paid off to switch sides. What's happened to them today?
Several of them are very prominent leaders in what's been a several months-long protest movement in Iraq. Others, for example, going back to my earlier point, is Ahmed Abu Risha, who is the brother of one of the founders of the people that he was referring to, called the Sahwa, who were Sunni tribesmen, Sunni tribal militias that were basically, yes, paid to join in the fight with the U.S. military siding against Al-Qaeda. And Abu Risha now, Ahmed Abu Risha, is one of the leaders of this protest movement against the Iraqi government that's been voicing a great feeling of disenfranchisement among the Sunni community. There are other members, lower-ranking members who've been incorporated into the security force and the civil service to some degree, but there are still very many of them, thousands of fighters who, militiamen who haven't been incorporated into the security services or the civil service or given any kind of job as they've been promised by the government.
All right, and when we come back, we're going to take a look at some more reactions to this 10th year anniversary, including that of the former British Prime Minister. Stay with us.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.